Hey there, guys. So Monday, we talked a little bit about the civil rights movement, and we specifically were talking about what led to the civil rights movement, which was those Jim Crow laws that created laws that were unconstitutional against African Americans, and they circumvented what the Constitution stated would be that all men are created equal. One of the things that we left off on was how Dr. Martin Luther King modeled his format for peaceful protesting because of Mahatma Gandhi, who was an Indian civil rights activist. As a result of his peaceful protests, many Americans who were watching the protests through video and basically from the news had realized that these peaceful protesters were being beaten and sprayed with water hoses and attacked by dogs and by the police. So they realized at this point that the civil rights movement and the leaders of the civil rights movement were not being treated very fairly. So as a result, a lot of people started to support the civil rights movement. During this time in 1963, African American leaders such as Martin Luther King set up something called what is now known as the March on Washington. This march involved over 1 million people, and they congregated at the Lincoln Memorial Center in Washington, D.C., where they were demanding the improvement of social and economic opportunities for African Americans under the law. On the steps of the memorial is where Dr. King gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The march was a success. Dr. King and the civil rights leaders gained a lot of attention from the White House at this point and from John F. Kennedy. They were invited to actually meet John F. Kennedy to go ahead and discuss the civil rights issues that were existing in the United States at the time. Something that you definitely need to know. Things continued to change. When a new president suddenly came into the White House, it was because on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. He was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald while he was in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. As a result, President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn into office to become president. He challenged his own party and many fellow Southerners when he continued pressing on for Kennedy's Civil Rights Initiative. So he basically kept trying to push forward the Civil Rights Act and the civil rights laws that John F. Kennedy had been already putting into play before he was assassinated. One of the notable achievements for President Johnson was when he signed the Civil Rights Act. This law ended the discrimination based on race by ensuring that equal access to public accommodations, which included anywhere that they went, whether it was restaurants or it was transportation or public bathrooms, that all people could use them regardless of the color of their skin. It basically also called for equal hiring regardless of race. So if you had the qualifications to apply for a job and to do that job, then regardless of whether you were Black or white, you should be able to ascertain that job. In 1965, changes continued to develop within the civil rights legislation. Congress had passed President Johnson, Congress had passed laws. Johnson had signed in the Voting Rights Act. This gave African Americans the right to vote equally. Prior to this, African Americans, even though they were told they could vote, they were given many obstacles, or many obstacles were placed in front of them, such as poll taxes that they couldn't afford to pay, or having to take literary tests or literacy tests that nobody could really pass. If you watch movies that are documenting the history, there are cases where they say that they had like big jugs of jelly beans and they had to guess the exact number of the jelly beans in the jug if they could, in order to vote, which obviously was pretty much impossible. And even if they did guess the right number, they were told they were wrong. So it was anything they could do to block them from voting, they did. Why would they do that? Well, because if African Americans were able to vote, then they could vote for people who were going to support the civil rights movement, and many of the Southern whites did not want that. The Voting Rights Act basically outlawed the state laws that required poll taxes and those literary tests, which had been a method of denying the African American and Blacks the right to vote. In the South, the 15th Amendment could not be circumvented. In other words, you could not follow what the 15th Amendment stated, which was that everybody had a right to vote, including African Americans. In 1967, there were still changes happening. President Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall, who many of you learned about back in third grade. He became the first African American Supreme Court justice, where he had 13 years earlier argued for the schools desegregating. Now he joined as the Supreme Court justice, so he was basically a judge for the Supreme Court, and he was there and actually served as a judge until 1991. So during the time of the civil rights movement and the legislation and the changes of laws, conditions for African Americans were trying to be improved. We also were improving life for farm workers. So it wasn't just African Americans. We also had farm workers who were not being treated very fairly, who were having to work under very bad or awful work conditions, weren't being paid fairly. So there was an advocate for the farmers, and his name was Cesar Chavez. Again, you should have learned about him back in the younger grades, but we're going to go a little bit in more depth about who Cesar Chavez was. Cesar Chavez actually helped to organize the farm workers in California and to create a union. And that union helped to fight, it was the labor union, helped to fight for farmers on behalf of the farmers to help them to achieve better pay, helping to them to have better working conditions and to be treated more fairly. Cesar Chavez is most well known as a labor leader and an organizer, and he helped to start the National Farm Workers Association in 1962. Similar to Dr. King, he stressed nonviolent forms of protest, such as boycotting, marches, and hunger strikes to achieve his goals. He did not believe that fighting or violence was the way to gain the goals that he wanted or to achieve those goals. His most famous boycott was against grape growers and his effort to improve life and working conditions for many of the nation's poorest workers. So to walk away from this video, there are things that I want you to remember. So if you need to go back and watch it and take notes, please do. But the first thing I want you to remember is that the Civil Rights Act, what it portrayed and what it outlined and said that could be done for African Americans, the Voting Rights Act and what that did for Americans, Dr. Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and what was the result of the March on Washington, John F. Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson coming into office, Cesar Chavez as a labor union leader, and the protest that he created, the biggest boycott that he created or organized, which was the grape growers boycotting against the grape growers, and how Cesar Chavez was looking for better working conditions and payment and equality and treatment within the farming industry. So today, I want you to focus on watching both of these videos, the one that I put on Monday, watch the one from today, and then go back and take notes. Another thing I needed you to remember, I'm sorry, was that Thurgood Marshall was the first Supreme Court justice, African-American Supreme Court justice. Also think back to Monday's video, how he fought for the segregation or the desegregation of schools with the Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So go back and look at that, take those notes. You will be taking a unit test on this the week after spring break. So this information is going to help. Your unit test will be on Study Island. So just check in tomorrow. You can watch the next video. I'm going to go through every single one of the standards so that you know exactly what you need to know. Okay. You guys enjoy. Talk to you soon.